Unit 17 Canada. Content 17.1 Introduction, 17.2 Economic History of Canada, 17.3 Canadian Economy and Overview, 17.4 Emergence of Economic Nationalism, 17.5 Macdonald Commission Future Economic Prospects, 17.6 Economic and Social Indicators, 17.7 Relationship with India, 17.8 Conclusion, and 17.9 Further Reading. Learning objectives. This unit makes an attempt to explore the economic history of Canada, the emergence of economic nationalism in Canada, the economic development and policies in the post-World War II period, and the indicators of social development in Canada. 17.1 Introduction. Canada, the world's second largest country, contains an extremely wide variety of geographical features ranging from the magnificent Rocky Mountains, the warm blue Pacific Ocean on the west coast, to beautiful lakes and the magnificent Niagara Falls in the central Canada. Moreover, Canada is the largest country in the Western Hemisphere with a total area of 99,70,610 square kilometer and the world's largest coastline extending over 2,44,000 kilometers as well. Canada's economy is not only one of the soundest in the world but has been ranked the number one country in the world for several years. The United Nations has ranked Canada as the best country in the world to live in. The survey compared a total 174 countries using 200 performance indicators including access to education, quality healthcare, a low indicator of crime in Canadian cities, and a clean environment. Canada ranks fourth in the world as per Human Development Index, behind only to Norway, Sweden, and Australia and Canada, the eighth largest trading nation in the world, with its relatively low levels of inflation, is not only an active foreign investor on the global front, but also receives a high degree of foreign investment from all over the world. Canada, with its population of 31.4 million, was formed from a confederation of 10 provinces and 2 territories in 1867. At present, Canada has 10 provinces and 3 territories, each with its own capital city. The present unit exposes you to a brief background of Canada and major economic activities of different regions of Canada. It looks into the economic history of Canada, which shows a clear shift in the economic approaches of Canada and her commitment for regional unity in trade affairs. Even while Canada shows trade openness, there had been attempts in the country from certain quarters for an economic nationalism. These points also discuss the unit. Also, along with the discussion on economic development of the country, the unit also elicits on the social indicators of development of the country. 17.2 Economic History of Canada. Though Canada is a single economic unit, but to begin with, in the following section, we will view the economic background of Canada by region. First, Central Canada. Initially, most of the native people were hunters and food gatherers, and agriculture was practiced by a very small number of Iroquois groups. There was no specialized merchant class, but trading was common. Due to the arrival of French and British traders in the 16th century, a great deal of economic and cultural changes occurred among the native people. Much of central Canada's industry, including the country's two great industries, milling and lumbering, was dispersed through the countryside or in small villages even in 1971 and afterwards due to a rapid industrialization and urbanization. By 1911, half of Ontario's population lived in the cities and towns. Second, Atlantic Canada. In addition to fur trading, sea fisheries brought about a major economic development in the Atlantic region. But the 1920s and 1930s were unhappy decades when the iron, steel, coal, and machinery industries were in chronic difficulty, and like the fishery, they suffered in the Great Depression. Nor did new manufacturers make much headway in spite of continuing federal subsidies for rail transport. The few rays of hope included new pulp and paper plants and new protected markets for apples and lumber in Britain. World War II brought a hectic prosperity to those communities which served the naval and air bases, and after 1945 the situation improved. Third, Western Canada. Fur trade was the beginning of economic development in Western Canada. In the late 1890s, the prospects of development brightened as world prices rose, transport costs fell, methods of dry land farming improved, and more appropriate variety of wheat became available. Until 1929, the prairie provinces enjoyed an immense expansion of wheat economy onto which was grafted before 1940. A very much larger rail system and network of cities and towns, coal mining and ranching. By 1940, the frontier of settlement had been pushed well towards the northwest, attracting migrants from many foreign lands. The result was a regional economy which depended almost entirely upon the world price of single crop and local yields, both of which fluctuated greatly. Reflections and Action 17.1. Do market have any role to play in the economy of the country? Mention the reasons with example. With new projects in oil, gas pipeline, building and potash, the year after 1945 saw resource-based development, rapid urbanization and dramatic increases in standards of living. New market in erstwhile USSR, China and in developing nations for wheat opened up new horizons. The western provinces remain heavily dependent on the export of a few primary products and on the investment activity which the primary industries could generate. The West remained development minded as it had been between 1896 and 1914. Most of the Canadians were doing white collar jobs and staying in cities by 1980s. There were less disparities in income and standard of living, but the economies of the various regions were quite different, ranging from manufacturing to generation of surpluses of national products. During this period, despite all this development in the Atlantic province, living standards were comparatively low. 17.3 Canadian Economy and Overview. Canada has always been an open economy. Openness to trade, capital, and labor has been an intrinsic part of country's economic success, but also exposes the economy to fluctuations. From the establishment of continuous European settlement until 1850, Canada was a colonial economy integrated primarily with French and then British economy. The 1840s and 1850s mark a watershed as Britain's adopted free trade policies and allowed the Britain North American colonies to determine their own trade policies. This coined with the growth of wheat exports from different parts of the country. The major features of the last half of the 19th century were attempts to industrialize behind tariff barriers and the steady reorientation of international economic relationship from Great Britain to USA. The orientations toward the USA were rarely encouraged by trade policies after the non-renewal of Reciprocity Treaty in 1866. Canada and the USA even came close to a trade war towards the end of the first decade of 1900. The main source of foreign capital remained the UK, but US direct foreign investment in Canada accelerated from the 1870s to 1940. Migration pattern depend on the relative attractiveness of settlement of Canadian and American frontiers. The prairie wheat boom led to large changes in total population and its distribution across the country. Since it coincidence with the large scale immigration from East Europe, the prairie's population had a different composition that of the rest of the Canada. The period 1914 to 39 was one of the instability in domestic and world economy. In 1920, saw rapid growth and continuation of the reorientation of economic relations towards the USA. By the mid-1930s, Canada was trying to convince the USA to negotiate reciprocal trade liberalization. During and after 1939 to 45 war, Canada depended to convince USA and UK to lead the world to a liberal trading system based on liberal trade policies. Although Canada played an active role in GATT and was firm proponent of multilateralism, trade barriers were reduced more slowly than in other industrialist countries. Nevertheless, there was a substantial liberalization of trade barriers, and Canada was a major player in the world economy, reflected in its presence at the G7 summits, which began in 1970s. Despite the multilateral, non-discriminatory approach, Canada's trade remained highly concentrated on the USA. During the long economic boom of the 1950s and 60s, Canada also experienced large inflows of labor and capital. Canada was orientation towards the USA and those features. Canada was an open economy integrated into the world economy, but it was heavily orientation towards the USA, and those features could not be readily changed. Attempts to regulate foreign investment led to a friction with the USA without noticeably diminishing the presence of US operations in Canadian life. By 1970s, the UK had ceased to be a major trading partner and then next most important region after North America as East of Asia, a phenomenon especially apparent in Vancouver. An affluent high-tech industrial society, Canada today closely resembles the US in its market orientation, economic system, pattern of production, and high living standards. Since World War II, the impressive growth of manufacturing, mining, and several sectors has transformed the nation from a largely rural economy into one primary industrial and urban. The unemployment rate has been decreasing steadily, and the real rates of growth have averaged nearly 3% since 1993. The government budget surpluses are primarily devoted to reducing the large public sector debt. In 1989, US-Canada Free Trade Agreement and 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement have touched off a dramatic increase in trade and economic integration with the US. With its great natural resources, skilled labor force, and modern capital plant, Canada was anticipate solid economic progress in the future. The continuing constitution impasse between English and French-speaking areas is raising the possibility of a split in the federation, making foreign investors somewhat edgy. Around September 1998, the Canadian dollar had reached an all-time low of less than 65 cents against the US dollar. However, since then it was steadily climbed forward and recently had an amazing run, touching about 80 cents against the US dollar. The recent success of Canadian dollar is driven largely by the engagement of US in the Iraq War, the huge deficit in the fiscally imprudent US administration, and what would be argued in the battering of the US employment outlook by such trends as outsourcing and high immigration. However, even the height of the Canadian dollar, which was reached around October 2004, compares unfavorably to the historical record. The value of Canadian dollar has quite commonly been in the 85 to 90 cents US range. Box 17.1, Canada and North American Free Trade Agreement. In January 1994, Canada, the United States and Mexico launched the North American Free Trade Agreement and formed the world's largest free trade area. In addition, NAFTA was established a strong foundation for the future growth and has set valuable example of the benefits trade of liberalization. The North American Free Trade Agreement has brought economic growth and rising standards of living from the people of all three member countries since 1994, as well by strengthening the rules and procedures governing trading and investment throughout the continent. NAFTA has proved to be a solid foundation for building Canada's future prosperity. NAFTA has established both Canada and Mexico to increase their exports to the United States. Canadian manufacturers now send more than half their production to the US, while Mexico's share of the US import market has also doubled from 6.9% in pre-NAFTA in 1993 to 13.6% in 2002. Manufacturers in all three countries are better off able to realize their full potential by operating in a large, most integrated and efficient North American economy. In 2002, Canada was the most important destination for merchandise exports from 39 of the 50 US states. Following a financial tariff reduction between Canada and Mexico, which took effect on January 1st, 2003, virtually all trade in the NAFTA region has followed tariff-free. Canada is a successful trading nation. Her exports around for over 40% of the total economic product, a higher proportion than any other G7 country. An estimated 1 in 4 jobs in Canada is linked to her success in global markets. NAFTA has played a significant role in that achievement. Today, 86.6% of total merchandise exports to go to NAFTA partners, and close to 2.3 million jobs have been created in Canada since 1994, representing an increasing of 17.5% over pre-NAFTA employment levels. So you can go through the website dfiitjc.ca. So 17.4, Emergence of economic nationalism. The movement of economic nationalism in Canada was aimed at achieving greater control by Canadians of their own economy. The movement, which was a result of foreign control of the Canadian economy, has two main separate areas of concern. First, protectionism in trade. It was in fact a consequence of national policy 1979, which was to encourage the creation of an industrial base in Canada by protecting small industries against the competition of larger and more established firms. Similarly, protection in trade was to establish a system of tariff to favor domestic production of goods and to discourage import, foreign controls. The second area of concern related with the ownership of Canadian business by foreigners. It was a post-World War II phenomenon. After World War II, there was a rapid increase of foreign ownership in Canadian economy, which was linked to the rise of multinational corporations. A number of multinationals started their own plants or subsidiaries inside Canada. As the ownership of these foreign corporations increased, there has been increased concern shown especially by the economic nationalists, who as a result demand legislations to monitor the activities and check the growth of foreign ownership in Canadian economy. But there was another group which was in favor of free and unhampered trade with all nations. This view was naturally based on doctrines of economics known as law of comparative advantage. The argument is that the economic growth will be maximized when government restrained in minimized and all countries specialize in the goods they produce best and trade freely with each other. Keeping this doctrine in mind, a condition also laid down for foreign companies that foreign owners firms would succeed in establishing themselves in Canada only to the extent that they could produce their goods more cheaply than local firms, thus benefiting Canadian consumers and Canadian economy. This argument was based on a competitive economic environment with the relevance of free markets, but it was questioned by an economic nationalist who saw the presence of multinationals and the American firm as not healthy for the small industries of Canada. The concerns of economic nationalists were articulated in a series of government-sponsored reports drawn up over past several decades. A Golden Commission. The first report on Canada's economic prospects in 1955 to 1957 was established as a result of increased foreign ownership in Canadian economy. It was named Gordon Commission after its chairman, Walter Gordon. The growth of foreign direct investment was pointed out. It was also felt that the legitimate Canadian interests were being compared in the process. The report recommended that Canadians be permitted at least part ownership in foreign-owned subsidiaries operated in Canada. Unfortunately, the report did not receive much attention, and general argument was that the Canadian workers in particular would benefit by the removal of all restrictions to trade and foreign direct investment, for nothing would raise the level of economic activity and boost incomes more rapidly. In 1960s, a new wave of economic nationalism emerged, which ultimately led to three more government-sponsored reports in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which distributed various problems created by foreign-owned subsidies operating in Canada. There were a number of problems. For instance, Canadian branch plants not only lacked the facilities to conduct research and development but also lacked full-fledged marketing and purchasing department, because these functions would also be managed by the parent firm in the US or Europe. The other major problem was related to management. Since the companies were directed from abroad, Canadian managers and management were not able to develop their full potential. We can infer from above that the dependence on various US capabilities was slowly being built into the structure of Canadian industry, leaving it less able to adapt to change and international competition. Moreover, the lack of Canadian directors on the boards of foreign-owned subsidiaries led to less number of orders for Canadian companies. A number of policies were recommended in response to these various problems. The Watkins Task Force. In its report published in 1968, it recommended that a creation of a special agency to coordinate government policies and programs dealing with multinational corporations, to monitor the behavior of these firms by providing more information on their activities was one of the tasks of the agency. Reflection and Action 17.4. To what extent the MNCs should be allowed to trade in any country? Whatever it should be free trade or restrained trade. Discuss. See, one report. This report was published in 1970 and made a suggestion that the Canadians should attempt to secure 51% ownership in foreign firms, and laws should be made so as to countervail American extraterritorial jurisdiction. These laws would effectively make it illegal for corporations operating in Canada to refuse legitimate export order from any country, regardless of the nature of what country's diplomatic relations with the US. It also proposed that any future takeovers of Canadian business by foreign owners firms should require the consent of a control bureau, such as one outlined by the Walk-in report, and that certain key sectors of economy should be identified where no further takeovers would be allowed. The Gray Report. The Gray Report, published in 1972, also known as Foreign Direct Investment in Canada, recommended the establishment of a screening agency and also specified the particular areas to be permitted for or forbidden for foreign direct investment. These reports, in a way, formed the basic of nationalist sentiments in Canada in 1970s. In 1974, the Foreign Investment Review Agency, based on the recommendations of Watkins, Vance, and Gray reports, began to review all the proposals for foreign takeovers of existing business or the creation of new foreign-owned businesses in Canada for the purpose of ensuring maximum benefits to Canadian from these enterprises. FIRA was structured by very closely upon the recommendations by the Gray report, and Herb Gray became its first chairman. Due to the influence of economic nationalism movement in 1980s, the National Energy Program was established by the Liberal governments to monitor the security of Canada's energy supply and to provide Canadians with the opportunity to increase their ownership of the energy industry. In a nutshell, we can say that the economic nationalism in Canada can best be understood in the context of Canadian dependence on the US. In addition to economic regulation, social and cultural regulation has also been used to promote national unity and cultural identification. 17.5 Macdonald Commission Future Economic Prospect. This commission is so far is the largest in Canadian history, appointed in 1982 to examine the future economic prospects of the country and the effectiveness of its political institutions. It was chaired by Donald S. Macdonald, a former Minister of Finance. The commission also included 12 other commissioners who represented diverse sections of Canadian society. The three-volume report released in September 1985 made a number of recommendations reflecting three underlying themes. First, the report emphasized that Canada should maintain an adaptive economy capable of adjusting rapidly to international economic changes and new technologies. Greater reliance on market mechanism as opposed to government's interventions, and a free trade agreement with the US were the hallmark of this theme. Second, while the Commission agreed that the overall scope of the welfare state should be maintained, the report recommended reforms to important income security programs to ensure a great economic efficiency and social equity. Third, the Commission reaffirmed the traditional model of parliamentary government but recommended the adoption of an elected Senate to sensitize the federal government more fully to the aspiration of Canada's diverse region. Despite its recommendations and substantial support it received from the business community, governments, and the media, the report was criticized by the labor movement, nationalist groups, and social activities. Between 1984 and 1999, though some segments of the population enjoyed increases in the wealth, the ground reality was that the wealth distributions in Canada became much unequal. We can analyze the present economy of Canada by taking into account a number of social and political indicators. 17.6 Economic and social indicators, goods and services. The best way to describe the Canadian economy is to examine what kind of goods and services they produce and consume, what sort of job they do, how much they earn, and whom they work for and trade with. Canadians have long been famous to themselves but not to others as havers of wood and drawers of water. And the country's development was initially motivated by a desire to exploit the country's natural resources. At the same time, it's also true that while the resources industry still account for a significant share of overall economic activity in Canada, as in other developed countries, most output is produced in the manufacturing and service sectors. In 1997, manufacturing accounted for 18% of overall Canadian output, while agriculture and other resources industries, forestry, fishery, fishing, trap, mining, and petroleum and electric power, gas, and water together accounted for under 15%. Canada has a larger service sector and smaller manufacturing sector. In 1997, 73% of workers were employed in the service sectors, with 50.5% in manufacturing and only 5.1% in agriculture and natural resources. B. Nature of work. Another way to describe Canadian economy activity is to look at the kinds of amounts of work Canadians do, not at what they produce. The distinctions between what is produced and the type of work done to produce it is often forgotten, but of course is crucial. Moreover, mechanization has also resulted in the number of direct production workers. The number of Canadians who actually hew, draw, drill, or farm for a living is minuscule, while 7 out of 10 Canadians now work in white-collar occupations. At the same time, there has been a drastic increase in the rate of participation from 55% in 1946 to 64.8% in 1997, which is mainly due to the participation of women into labor force. The female participation rate increased from 24.7 to 57.5, while the male rate declined from 85% to 72.5%. The main factors responsible for this increased rate of female participations are improved methods of birth control, the interventions of labor-saving home appliances, change in attitudes, the growth of public sector, etc. By the participation rate has been less successful in checking the unemployment rate that has risen from an average of 5.2% in 1960s to 6.7% in 1970s, now in 0.9% between 1980 to 1986. These are two main factors responsible for a rise in unemployment rate. On one hand, it is believed that due to unemployment insurance program, many people prefer to undergo periodic spells of unemployment, and there are many more secondary workers, women and young people mainly, who presumably are not as desperate for employment as was the archetypical workers of the 1950s. the male head of a household in which no one else earned an income. On the other hand, the unemployment rate for prime age males has also been creeping up over last 2 decades, but in 1996 the unemployment rate has been decreasing from 9.6% in 96 to 9.1 in 97 and 7.6 in 2003. This is the social indicator table has given here in against each years 1996 to 2003. The table has given here, and labor force, total employed men, women, workers employed part-time, in that men, women separate, and military part-time, looked for full-time work, percentage of women employed, those youngest kid is saying different unemployment rate of different years, that also divided between the men age as per the age, and for men and women, and also population, education, and community, which all colleges and all this thing, agriculture, this all the. So this all shows Statistics Canada Labor Force Survey, Educations in 2000 catalog, and Center for Education Statistics. This various data is available here. We can go through that to get more about what's happening between those years. So about education, education plays the important roles in the development of individuals and society, of empowering people, enhancing their decision making power. It is known that the level of education influences the type of jobs people obtain and the income they receive. As per the 2001 census, people with a bachelor's degree were more likely to have higher earning than high school graduates. Another trend was also observed related to education, as more and more jobs required post-secondary education. Young men and women became more likely to extend their stay in parents' home and delay marriage and starting their own families. Data from the census shows that Canadians have continued to upgrade their education in order to get good jobs to support themselves and their families. It is not surprising that the Canadian population now enjoys a major education than ever, and Canada ranks highest among the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries in the proportion of its working age population with college and university education combined. In addition to workforce, education, job opportunities, etc., there are other indicators which determine the living standards or economic growth of any country. Reflection 17.3. Taking stock of the economic and social indicators of development access, the present development trends of Canada. When it comes to education, we can observe that the educational achievement acquired by Canadians over the past 50 years has enormous. The proportion of individuals and a university degree, for example, surged tenfold, and 2% of the population aged 25 and above 1951 to 20% in 2001, while the share of Canadians with less than grade 9 plunged from 55% to 11%. The trend towards the university education was evident during 90s. The proportion of individuals aged 25 and over in a university degree rose from 15% to 20% from 1991 and to 2001. So the three development patterns: a global and technological advancement economy where wealth is created by increasingly well-trained workers, the arrival of highly skilled immigrants of 90s and uncertain labor market conditions during the recessions of the early 90s emphasized the higher education. So living standards in Canada. Canadians enjoy high standard of living. The usual estimate plan Canadian GP has per capita 5% to 15% below the US level and roughly equal to that in the North European democracies. In fourth quarter of the year of 2003, economic growth advanced 0.9%, with exports being main contributor to growth. Canadians continued to spend more on travel, services, and demand for industrial goods and materials strengthened 3.9% as manufacturers' activities increased. Consumer spending was the greatest contributor to the growth in 2003. Growth in personal spending increased plus 3.3%, matched the average growth of the latest decade and was similar to the growth of 2002. Furniture and floor covering sales remained strong, plus 8.1%, influenced by the housing boom, but slowed from the previous year. The labor income grew to 3.4%, the lowest growth since 1996, although employment Growth was weak at the beginning of 2003. A surge at the end of the year boosted labor income in the fourth quarter. Employment growth in the service producing industries exceeded growing in the goods producing industries. Disposable income grew to 2.8%, about half of the increase in the personal expenditures. As a result, saving by the personal sector plummeted and the saving rate fell to 2.2%, the lowest of the decade. Net household borrowing increased $43 billion in 2003 and followed an increasing $16 billion in 2002. We should not, however, conclude from the above analysis that Canada represents a homogeneous society based on equality. The reality points towards the number of regional problems related to unequal economy. The 5 traditional regions of Canada have significant different industrial structures. The manufacturing sector is the most important field of activity in Ontario and Quebec. Agriculture, petroleum and mining in the prairies, fishing and agriculture in maritimes, and forestry and fishing in British Columbia. Reflections and Action 17.4. Is there any relationship between development and equality? Canada is one of the developed countries of the world, but does this refers to equal economy as well? Explain. These regional disparities of regional differences in per capita income have remained more or less constant. Inequalities among incomes of individuals Canadians are in fact much greater. Although some people enjoyed increases in wealth over the 1984 to 1999 period, others did not, with the result that during this period wealth distribution became more unequal. A study conducted to analyze the wealth inequalities concluded the fact the trend was more towards unequal wealth distribution. Some groups such as young couple with children and recent immigrants have suffered substantial declines. The growing proportions of young couple with children who have zero or negative wealth suggests that a non-negligible fraction of today's young families have been vulnerable to negative shocks, having no accumulated saving that can provide liquidity in periods of economic stress. There is a need to modify policies aimed at redistribution, keeping in mind the social framework of society. That is, there should be more equality in distribution of wealth, but the same trend is evident in other developed countries. Moreover, Canada is not only a world leader in telecom innovation, connectivity, software development, and the internet economy, and is also popular for its wood products for construction, renovation, and interior decoration. 17.7. Relationship with India. India is an important trading partner of Canada. Bilateral trade between India and Canada almost tripled in the last decades to reach 2.2 billion Canadian dollar in 2003. India has been and remains one of the Canada's priority markets, an emerging source of foreign direct investment to Canada. Export to India grew from $674 million in 2002 to $733 million in 2003, and increases of 80.7%. So significant increases were recorded for paper, aircraft, fertilizer, iron and steel, and textiles, sportswear. Canada's main exports to India include telecom equipments, peas, pulses, potash, and wood pulp. India exports to Canada increased from $1.3 billion in 2002 to $1.4 billion in 2003. Export to Canada are predominantly apparel, yarn and fabric, precious stones, spices, leather items, and frozen seafood. 17.8. Conclusion. Canada, one of the most industrialized countries in the world, ranks fourth in terms of human development. It is one of the strongest and healthiest among the 7 leading industrial countries in the G7, which consist of US, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, and Japan. Between 1997 to 2004, Canada experienced the strongest growth in the employment among the G7 countries. The driving force behind the recent economic development in Canada are global in scope, such as rising energy prices, and have contributed to the appreciation of Canadian dollar. The earlier sections of this unit explore the economic scenario in the country. Along with the economic development of the country, people and the government of Canada gives equal importance to social and environmental development of the country. In an attempt to develop into a knowledge-based economy, Canada emphasizes the need to provide individuals with knowledge, skills, and competencies to participate effectively in society and economy. The later half of the unit looks into the social sectors of development in Canada. 17.9 further reading. James H. Marsh, 1988, Canadian Encyclopedia, 2nd edition, Volume 1, and there is Eugene P. Walls, the Canadian Encyclopedia, Macdonald and Stowarting, Toronto. So this is the end of the unit 17. Thank you very much.